I originally thought I wanted to do a book about old Beijing, and I wanted to make sure I was living in an environment where I could examine and experience old Beijing's daily life. I looked online at several places that had courtyard homes for rent, and often I would show up and the landlord or the owner would say, sorry, it's going to be torn down. And so Beijing social networks move horizontally, like the streets themselves. You sort of get past like knots joining rope from person to person. And I eventually ended up in the neighborhood where I based the book, which is Dazhalan, or in Beijinghua. In Beijing, it's Dazhalan. And it happens to be the oldest neighborhood in Beijing. I rented the house first, and then I went knocking on the elementary school gate and said I'd like to be a volunteer teacher here. So I was quite fortunate that this all worked out. I think the title of the book, The Last Days of Old Beijing, is a bit of a trope because Beijing's 600-year history is filled with last days of quote-unquote old Beijing because it changes generationally, it changes through different historical periods and different regimes. But yeah, it's the people. It's the people. And I thought when I moved to this neighborhood, I was writing a book about the disappearance of historic architecture. What I learned quite quickly is I was really documenting the disappearance of a densely, tightly knit community and the people who made it so. It's very difficult in Beijing to fight City Hall, and everybody knows that because most people, especially in Dazhalan, this neighborhood, were alive on June 4th, 1989, where the events of the square happened within hundreds of meters of where they're living. They also know the older generation who have been there, they've essentially been living on the dole for the last 5 decades. Their rent was subsidized to the point where the monthly rent was equivalent to the cost of a pack of cigarettes. And so they themselves will admit that, in some ways we've been quite fortunate. This wasn't our house to begin with. We were assigned to live here. We've got to live in central Beijing for these last 40 or 50 years at a very nominal price. And now in the name of development, which is good because we're patriotic Chinese, we will move out. It gets a little more complicated when you're talking about migrants who are coming into Beijing and renting these homes, because when they're evicted, they have to go and find a new place to rent because they don't have even the usage rights for this home. For them, they're being uprooted from where their child is going to elementary school. They're being uprooted from their local business that maybe they run, say a noodle shop or a shoe repair shop or a cigarette selling shop. And so for them, they're really questioning, what have we done by moving to Beijing in the first place? We thought we were adding to Beijing culture by being here, our accents becoming like a Beijinger's, our child's going to school, we're paying taxes, we're supporting the status quo. Okay, well the locals, we understand why they're a little more willing to leave because they've been here for a while, although not happy. But for the newcomers, it's really difficult to understand when they thought they were doing everything right by making this move from the countryside into the capital, and now they're being pushed out. They do have a fatalistic, some would say pragmatic attitude towards this. Beijingers themselves are quite pragmatic, and you'd have to be living in a city which changes without your control constantly. People are always asking me, whose city is this? Who makes the decisions? Because it's not us. And you start your day by walking out your front door and looking to the left or the right, to the wall of your home, to see if it had been painted with the symbol that meant destroy or demolish overnight. No one knows who paints those characters. In the book, I described it as the hand, moves through the spectral apparition that comes through at night and paints that order to demolish. People were fatalistic, and one of the reasons they are is they don't own these homes, by and large. In some parts of Beijing or on the lakes and in wealthier areas, people still have their rights to their courtyard. But in this neighborhood, housing rights were taken by the state in the 1950s. People were assigned to live there. They were paying a very nominal rent. And so they often felt that when this house is marked for destruction, what's really happening here is that Beijing is getting out of the landlord business when it comes to these houses. Beijing government wants us to move to a faraway apartment. You can use this land, centrally located land, for commercial space or different high-rises, and we have no say in the matter. And the best that they could do was negotiate a better settlement for a new apartment in the outskirts of town. I understand too, in the book, I'm very pragmatic. I'm not romantic about the situation because I've lived in this environment for over 2 years. It's very difficult to live in. We're talking about no heat, no air conditioning, no toilet in the house, no hot water. And the younger generation in the hutong, in these lanes, can't wait to get out by and large, especially the women who want to start a family and they can't raise a child in this environment. So I do understand. I'm a bit pragmatic as well, I should say, about this situation. And I also understand the government's point of view, which is if you're an official appointed to the Beijing government from outside of Beijing, and you look at a neighborhood such as this, I think your first inclination would also be to say, this is substandard housing, this is a slum. It's not a slum, it's a warren of working poor people who are making their living. But I can see from an outsider's perspective of why you'd say, we need to clear this. We need to do something better here. The sad thing is that they're not clearing it to build new homes to let the community stay. I was surprised when I did the book tour in China because the book initially had been banned for 4 years after publication, but after 5 years of publication, it was suddenly allowed to appear in Chinese. And when I did the tour, I thought I'd be talking to people about historic Beijing and the importance of architectural preservation. Instead, this book, the media wanted to talk about and what people who came to the talks wanted to talk about was affordable housing. And that these lanes and these houses, even though they may be dilapidated, are in fact affordable options for the working class who come to these cities or are teaching in these neighborhoods. So I was surprised at that reaction. It was quite gratifying, actually. I hope every reader gets a sense of this neighborhood reminds them of their own neighborhood, or this neighborhood reminds them of the type of urban planning that American planners and Western planners are now trying to implement in our subdivisions, in our housing developments. And I said to a Beijing official once, the type of planning that Beijing is using right now is the type of planning that urban planners in America are trying to reverse. You don't have to make the same mistakes that America has made. And the official said with indignant pride, we have every right to make the same mistakes that America has made. And so I see this cycle happening right now where a lot of the clearances that are going on in Beijing are very reminiscent of what happened in American cities in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The end takeaway for me is that people in the hutong, in these neighborhoods in Beijing, wanted most of all to be heard. They wanted their voices to be heard, they wanted their stories to be told, and they wanted officials to know this isn't a slum, this is a working community. Which is why the happiest result for me, speaking of what I want readers to take away, is that this book was translated into Chinese. And I'm glad now that Chinese officials and planners have access to it. If they so choose to read it, they can see the reporting just outside the doorstep of the Great Hall of the People in the nation's capital.